Imagine a world ruled by a single, colossal empire stretching from the shores of Greece to the mountains of India, an empire that had stood for centuries, seemingly eternal and unshakable. Now, imagine one man, a king from a backwater kingdom, who in just 12 years would bring that empire to its knees. A man who would march his army over 20,000 miles, never losing a single battle. He was a military genius, a student of Aristotle, a self-proclaimed god, and a leader whose ambition knew no bounds. He was a hero to his men and a ruthless conqueror to his enemies. This is the story of a life that burned brighter than any other. A life that changed the map of the world forever. This is the story of Alexander the Great. Before we begin our journey from his birth to his mysterious death, we must understand why his story still echoes through the millennia. Alexander's influence extends far beyond the battlefield. He was a visionary who sought to fuse the cultures of East and West, creating a new Hellenistic world that would redefine art, science, and philosophy for centuries. His tactics are still studied at military academies today. His legend has inspired rulers, from Julius Caesar to Napoleon. To understand Alexander is to understand the turning point between the classical age and a new global era, an era forged in the fire of his ambition and the dust of his conquests. Our story begins in 356 BCE in the royal capital of Pella. Macedonia was a rugged, mountainous kingdom on the periphery of the Greek world, viewed by the sophisticated city-states of the south, like Athens and Sparta, as semi-barbaric. Yet, it was here, in this cauldron of fierce warriors and political intrigue, that a prince was born who would one day claim dominion over them all. Legend says that on the night of his birth, the great temple of Artemis at Ephesus, one of the 7 wonders of the ancient world, burned to the ground, a divine omen that the world could not contain 2 such great forces at once. The boy's father was Philip II, the most formidable man in Greece. Philip was a brilliant military reformer and a ruthless political strategist. He inherited a weak, fractured kingdom and transformed it into a military superpower. He redesigned the Macedonian army, lengthening their spears to create the unstoppable Sarissa phalanx and perfecting the use of combined arms with his elite cavalry. Philip was a man of boundless ambition who, through warfare and diplomacy, brought nearly all of Greece under his control. He was preparing for his life's ultimate goal, the invasion of the mighty Persian Empire, when his son, Alexander, came of age. Alexander's mother was Olympias, the 4th wife of Philip and a princess from the wild kingdom of Epirus. She was a fiery, intelligent, and deeply religious woman, a devotee of mystical cults. She claimed to be a descendant of the mythical hero Achilles and reportedly told Alexander that his true father was not Philip, but the king of the gods, Zeus, who had visited her in the form of a serpent. This potent mix of divine and heroic ancestry instilled in the young Alexander a powerful sense of destiny, a belief that he was no ordinary mortal, but a man chosen by the gods for unparalleled greatness. Her influence would shape his ambition for the rest of his life. From a young age, Alexander displayed the qualities that would define his life. He was fiercely competitive, intelligent, and possessed a charisma that drew others to him. The most famous story of his youth involves a wild, untamable stallion named Bucephalus, which none of Philip's best horsemen could mount. The young Alexander, perhaps only 12 years old, observed that the horse was afraid of its own shadow. He calmly turned the horse to face the sun, soothing it before leaping onto its back and riding it with ease. Philip, watching with tears of pride, declared, "My son, you must find a kingdom equal to yourself. Macedonia is too small for you." The royal court in Pella was a dangerous place, rife with jealousy, betrayal, and violence. The relationship between his parents, Philip and Olympias, was stormy and often hostile. As Philip took more wives, Olympias's position and Alexander's status as heir became increasingly precarious. This tension culminated at a wedding feast for Philip's newest wife, where a drunken general insulted Alexander's legitimacy. An enraged Alexander threw a cup at him, and Philip, also drunk, drew his sword and lunged at his own son, only to trip and fall. Alexander scornfully remarked, Here is the man who was preparing to cross from Europe to Asia, and he cannot even cross from one couch to another. The incident was a humiliation. Fearing for their lives, Alexander and his mother fled into exile. Although they were eventually reconciled with Philip, the event left a deep scar. It taught Alexander a harsh lesson about the fragility of power and the constant threat of betrayal. He learned to be wary, to trust few people completely, and to act decisively against any perceived threat. This environment of court intrigue forged in him a core of ruthlessness that would be essential for his survival and his future conquests. Recognizing his son's extraordinary intellect, Philip sought out the greatest mind in the Greek world to be his tutor, the philosopher Aristotle. For 3 years, in the tranquil temple of the nymphs at Mysa, Alexander and a select group of other noble youths who would become his lifelong friends and future generals studied under the master. This was no ordinary schooling. It was a comprehensive education in what it meant to be an ideal Greek ruler. Aristotle taught Alexander rhetoric, literature, science, medicine, and philosophy. He instilled in him a deep love for the works of Homer, especially the Iliad, which Alexander reportedly kept under his pillow for the rest of his life. Viewing the hero Achilles as his ultimate role model, Aristotle taught him about politics, the ethics of leadership, and the Greek concept of arete, or excellence. He also taught him about the world beyond Greece, of the vast Persian Empire, which Aristotle and many Greeks viewed as a decadent and tyrannical civilization deserving of conquest. The education at Mysa was profoundly transformative. It gave Alexander the intellectual framework for his ambition. It fired his curiosity about the natural world, leading him to bring scientists and historians on his future campaigns to document new lands, plants, and animals. Most importantly, it solidified his belief in the superiority of Greek culture and the idea that he had a mission to bring its civilizing influence to the barbarian world. This conviction, instilled by Aristotle, would become the philosophical justification for his conquests. Alexander's education was not confined to the classroom. His father, Philip, the master of war, ensured his son received a rigorous military upbringing. From a young age, Alexander was immersed in the life of a Macedonian soldier. He trained with the infantry, learned to ride with the cavalry, and studied the revolutionary tactics Philip had perfected. He learned firsthand how the long pikes of the phalanx could hold an enemy, while the heavy cavalry, acting as a hammer, could smash their flank. At the age of just 16, while Philip was away on campaign, Alexander was left as regent in Macedonia. When a Thracian tribe revolted, Alexander didn't wait for his father. He mustered an army, marched north, brutally crushed the rebellion, and founded a new city on the site, which he named Alexandropolis, the first of many. His true test came 2 years later at the decisive Battle of Chaeronea, where Philip's army faced a combined force of Athenians and Thebans. At the critical moment of the battle, the 18-year-old Alexander led the decisive cavalry charge that shattered the enemy line and secured Philip's mastery over all of Greece. These early experiences were invaluable. They taught Alexander not just how to fight, but how to lead. He earned the respect of the soldiers by sharing their hardships and fighting alongside them in the front ranks. He developed a keen eye for the flow of battle, an almost intuitive understanding of when and where to commit his forces for maximum impact. He had inherited his father's army, but he was quickly proving that he possessed a military genius that was entirely his own. In 336 BCE, at the height of his power, King Philip II was assassinated by one of his own bodyguards during his daughter's wedding celebration. The motive for the murder remains one of history's great mysteries. Was it a personal grievance? Or was there a wider conspiracy involving powerful figures, perhaps even Alexander's mother, Olympias, or the Persian Empire itself? The world will never know for sure. But in an instant, the most powerful man in Greece was dead, and the kingdom was thrown into chaos. The 20-year-old Alexander acted with lightning speed. With the backing of the army and his father's most powerful generals, he was proclaimed the new king, but his throne was far from secure. Potential rivals and claimants to the throne lurked in every corner of the court. Alexander showed the ruthless side forged in his childhood. He systematically and brutally eliminated every potential threat, executing cousins and powerful nobles he suspected of disloyalty. He secured his throne not through diplomacy, but through blood. News of Philip's death sent shockwaves through Greece. The city-states that Philip had subdued saw an opportunity to reclaim their freedom from what they saw as an inexperienced boy king. Revolts erupted across the north and south. Alexander responded with the same terrifying speed he had shown in the court. He marched his army south at an astonishing pace, appearing before the walls of cities that thought he was still hundreds of miles away. Through a combination of overwhelming force and shrewd diplomacy, he quickly quelled the rebellions and re-established Macedonian dominance. One city, however, refused to yield, the proud city of Thebes. Believing a rumor that Alexander had been killed in the north, the Thebans revolted and killed the Macedonian garrison. Alexander's response was swift and terrible. He besieged the city, stormed its walls, and made an example of it that would terrify all of Greece. He ordered the city to be razed to the ground, its buildings demolished, and its entire population, some 30,000 people, sold into slavery. Only the temples and the house of the poet Pindar were spared. The destruction of Thebes was a calculated act of terror. The message was brutally clear: this is the price of defying Alexander. The other Greek city-states, horrified by the fate of Thebes, quickly fell into line. They reaffirmed their allegiance and recognized Alexander as the new hegemon, or supreme commander, of the League of Corinth. He had secured his home front not with friendship, but with fear. With Greece now pacified, Alexander could finally turn his attention to his father's ultimate ambition, the invasion of the Persian Empire. This was to be framed not as a Macedonian conquest, but as a pan-Hellenic war of revenge, retribution for the Persian invasion of Greece over a century earlier. He spent the next year finalizing his preparations, gathering his army, and planning the logistics for the most audacious military campaign in history. In the spring of 334 BCE, Alexander led his army of around 40,000 men across the Hellespont into Asia Minor. His first challenge came at the Granicus River. The local Persian satraps, or governors, had assembled an army to confront him. They chose a strong defensive position, placing their infantry on the high ground and their cavalry along the steep riverbank, hoping to destroy the Macedonians as they struggled across the river. Against the advice of his cautious general Parmenion, who urged him to wait until morning, Alexander ordered an immediate attack. He knew that any hesitation would be seen as weakness. He led his elite companion cavalry himself, charging across the river and straight up the muddy bank into the teeth of the Persian cavalry. The fighting was fierce, and Alexander himself was nearly killed, his helmet split open by an axe, before he was saved by his friend Cletus the Black. But the ferocity of the Macedonian charge shattered the Persian cavalry line. With their cavalry broken, the Persian infantry, mostly Greek mercenaries, were surrounded and annihilated. The victory at the Granicus was stunning and decisive. In a single afternoon, Alexander had destroyed the Persian army in Asia Minor and broken the will of the local satraps. The path into the heart of Anatolia was now wide open. The victory sent a clear message to the Persian Empire and the Greek city-states in the region. Alexander was not just Philip's son. He was a force of nature, a commander of unparalleled audacity and skill. Following Granicus, Alexander marched south along the Ionian coast, liberating the Greek cities that had been under Persian rule for generations. He was hailed as a savior. His only major challenge came at the heavily fortified city of Halicarnassus, which boasted a strong wall and a powerful garrison commanded by the brilliant Greek mercenary Memnon of Rhodes. The siege was long and difficult, a brutal affair of siege towers, catapults, and bloody assaults. Eventually, Alexander's persistence and engineering prowess forced the defenders to abandon the city. As he moved through Asia Minor, Alexander demonstrated a shrewd understanding of governance. He did not impose harsh Macedonian rule. Instead, he overthrew the pro-Persian oligarchies and established democracies in the liberated Greek cities, winning their loyalty and support. In non-Greek territories, he often kept the existing local administrative structures in place, simply replacing the Persian satrap with one of his own Macedonian governors, ensuring a stable and efficient transition of power. Alexander understood that an empire could not be held by force alone. He engaged in constant diplomacy, forging alliances with local tribes and rulers who had grown tired of Persian domination. His strategy was to co-opt local elites, drawing them into his new administration. This pragmatic approach allowed him to secure the vast territory of Asia Minor with remarkable speed, creating a secure base of operations from which to launch his campaign into the Persian heartland. In 333 BCE, near the town of Issus, Alexander would face the great king himself for the first time. Darius III had gathered a massive new army and positioned it on a narrow coastal plain, confident that his superior numbers would crush the Macedonians. But the narrow terrain once again played into Alexander's hands, neutralizing the Persian numerical advantage. The battle unfolded in a similar fashion to Granicus. Alexander led his companion cavalry in a decisive charge, shattering the Persian left wing and then wheeling to attack the Persian center, where Darius commanded from his war chariot. Faced with the terrifying Macedonian charge, led by Alexander himself, Darius's nerve broke. He fled the battlefield, leaving his army to be slaughtered and, in his haste, abandoning his own mother, wife, and children. The next day, Alexander visited the captured royal family. Instead of treating them as spoils of war, he showed them the utmost respect and compassion, promising to care for them and treat them as royalty. He even reportedly told Darius's mother, Gambis, that he considered her his own mother. This act of chivalry was a calculated masterstroke of propaganda. News of his merciful treatment of the royal family spread throughout the Persian Empire, contrasting his image as a noble and magnanimous leader with that of Darius, the king who had cowardly abandoned his own family to save himself. The psychological blow to Darius's prestige was immense. He was no longer just a defeated king, he was a dishonored one. After Issus, Alexander continued his march south, determined to capture every coastal city to neutralize the Persian navy completely. His greatest challenge was the island fortress of Tyre, a city that believed itself to be impregnable. The Tyrians refused to surrender, confident that their powerful navy and island location would keep them safe. Alexander responded with one of the most incredible engineering feats of the ancient world. He ordered his men to build a massive stone causeway, or mole, nearly half a mile long, through the sea to the island. The siege of Tyre lasted for 7 grueling months. The Tyrians fought back fiercely, launching naval raids to attack the construction and using fire ships to try and burn the causeway. Alexander responded by assembling his own fleet from the cities he had already conquered. Defeating the Tyrian navy at sea, he constructed massive 150-foot-tall siege towers, the largest the world had ever seen, and moved them down the completed causeway to assault the city walls. His determination was absolute. Failure was not an option. When the walls were finally breached, Alexander's rage was unleashed. The city was brutally sacked. Thousands of Tyrians were killed in the fighting, and the remaining 30,000 citizens were sold into slavery. The fall of Tyre was a testament to Alexander's unshakable will. It sent a message to the rest of the world that nowhere was safe, and no fortress was impregnable. After Tyre, he marched south and took the fortress of Gaza in another brutal siege, completing his conquest of the eastern Mediterranean coast. The Persian navy was now a fleet without a port, effectively destroyed. Alexander marched into Egypt in 332 BCE, not as a conqueror, but as a liberator. The Egyptians had long chafed under Persian rule, which they saw as oppressive and disrespectful to their ancient gods and traditions. They welcomed Alexander with open arms, hailing him as a savior and crowning him as the new pharaoh, the legitimate heir to the ancient dynasties. In Egypt, Alexander made one of his most lasting contributions to civilization. On the Mediterranean coast, at the mouth of the Nile, he identified a site with a natural harbor and a perfect strategic location. There, he laid out the plans for a new city, which he named Alexandria. He envisioned it not just as a military outpost, but as a great center of trade, learning, and culture. A crossroads where the Greek world and the Egyptian world could meet. His vision would become a reality as Alexandria grew to become the intellectual and cultural capital of the ancient world. While in Egypt, Alexander embarked on a dangerous journey deep into the Libyan desert to visit the famed oracle of the god Ammon at the Siwa oasis. The god Ammon was seen by the Greeks as the equivalent of Zeus. What happened in the sanctuary is a mystery, but when Alexander emerged, the high priest had reportedly greeted him as the son of Ammon, or son of Zeus. For Alexander, this was the divine confirmation of what his mother had always told him. It solidified his belief in his own divinity and fueled his ambition to a level beyond that of any mortal king. In 331 BCE, Alexander marched out of Egypt to face Darius for the third and final time. At Gaugamela, Darius had assembled a colossal army on a wide, flat plain, perfectly suited for his cavalry and scythe chariots. Vastly outnumbered, Alexander deployed a tactical masterpiece. He advanced at an oblique angle, created a defensive flank in reserve, and devised a brilliant counter to the scythe chariots. The battle unfolded according to Alexander's design. The Persian chariots were neutralized, and his oblique advance created the exact gap he had predicted in the Persian line. He led his companion cavalry in a decisive wedge formation, charging straight for Darius. For the second time, the sight of Alexander in a full charge broke the great king's nerve. Darius fled, and his army, seeing their king abandon them once more, collapsed into a complete rout. The victory at Gaugamela was absolute. The Persian Empire, as a military force, was finished. Alexander marched his army into the legendary cities of Babylon and Susa, the administrative and economic capitals of the empire. He was welcomed as the new king and took possession of the vast Persian treasury, a fortune so immense it would fund his campaigns for years to come and fundamentally change the economy of the ancient world. From Babylon, Alexander marched to Persepolis, the ceremonial and spiritual heart of the Achaemenid Empire. After allowing his troops to loot the city, he committed one of the most controversial acts of his life. During a great victory feast, he ordered the magnificent palace complex of the Persian kings, one of the architectural wonders of the world, to be burned to the ground. The motivations behind this act are still debated by historians. Was it a drunken act of impulse, as some ancient sources suggest, or was it a calculated political act? Most likely, it was the latter. The burning of Persepolis was the ultimate symbol that the Achaemenid dynasty was finished. It was the final dramatic act of the Pan-Hellenic War of Revenge, payback for the burning of Athens by the Persian king Xerxes 150 years earlier. Whatever the reason, the destruction of Persepolis sent a powerful and irreversible message. It signaled the end of one era and the violent birth of another. For the Persians, it was an act of profound cultural vandalism. For Alexander, it was the final closing of a chapter, freeing him to move beyond a war of revenge and begin the creation of his own new empire. With the heart of the empire now in his hands, Alexander began the final phase of his conquest, the pursuit of the fugitive king, Darius. This was more than just a hunt for one man. It was a high-speed campaign to secure the vast eastern provinces of the Persian Empire before they could rally around a new leader. Alexander pushed his men at an incredible pace, covering huge distances in his relentless pursuit. Darius, now a king in name only, fled eastward, hoping to raise a new army in the provinces of Bactria and Sogdiana, but his authority had evaporated. His own noblemen and satraps, led by a man named Bessus, saw him as a failure and an obstacle. They betrayed him, placing him in chains and continuing the flight. When Alexander's pursuing forces finally closed in, Bessus and his co-conspirators stabbed Darius and left him to die on the side of the road. Alexander and his men arrived to find the once mighty king of kings bleeding to death. Alexander was reportedly moved by the sight, covering the body with his own cloak. He sent Darius's body back to be buried with full royal honors and declared that he would hunt down and punish the kingslayers. This was a shrewd political move, positioning himself not as a foreign conqueror, but as the legitimate successor to Darius, who was now tasked with avenging his death. With Darius dead, Bessus declared himself the new great king. Alexander marched his army into the remote and rugged eastern provinces of Bactria and Sogdiana, a land of harsh mountains and fierce warrior tribes. Here, he faced a new and difficult kind of war. Instead of set-piece battles, he was confronted with a brutal 3-year-long guerrilla campaign of ambushes, raids, and popular uprisings led by local warlords like Spidomenes. It was in these remote lands that Alexander, now 30 years old, met and fell in love with Roxana, the beautiful daughter of a local Sogdian nobleman. Their marriage was a genuine love match, but it was also a brilliant political move. By marrying a local princess, Alexander signaled his intention to rule not as a Macedonian conqueror, but as a king of both East and West. The marriage helped to pacify the region and build alliances with the local nobility, demonstrating his vision of a fused, multicultural empire. The campaigns in Bactria and Sogdiana were a brutal slog that tested Alexander and his army to their limits. They revealed the immense difficulty of governing such a vast and culturally diverse territory. Alexander responded by founding numerous new cities, also named Alexandria, to act as military garrisons and centers of Greek culture, hoping to control and civilize the surrounding region. The long and difficult campaigns in the east began to take a toll on the morale of the Macedonian army. Alexander's adoption of Persian customs, such as wearing Persian dress and demanding prostration, angered many of his traditionalist Macedonian officers. This simmering discontent erupted in 330 BCE with the discovery of a conspiracy against his life. A commander named Philotas, son of Alexander's most trusted and senior general, Parmenion, was accused of knowing about the plot and failing to report it. Under torture, Philotas confessed and implicated his father. Alexander, increasingly paranoid and intolerant of any dissent, had Philotas and the other conspirators executed, but he knew he could not leave the powerful and popular General Parmenion alive. Even though there was no evidence he was involved, he sent assassins back to where Parmenion was governing and had the old general, the man who had served his father and himself so faithfully, murdered without a trial. The execution of Parmenion was a dark turning point. It was a cold, political murder that shocked the army and stained Alexander's reputation. It demonstrated a new level of ruthlessness and paranoia in his leadership. The charismatic king who had once inspired unwavering loyalty was now beginning to rule through fear, and the bonds of trust between him and his Macedonian veterans were beginning to fray. With the East seemingly pacified, Alexander's insatiable ambition drove him onwards to a land of myth and legend, India. In 327 BCE, he led his army on one of the most remarkable military feats in history, crossing the formidable Hindu Kush mountain range into the Indus Valley. Here, he faced new terrain, a debilitating climate, and fierce kingdoms that refused to submit. His greatest challenge in India came at the Hydaspes River, where he faced King Porus, a giant of a man who commanded a powerful army. The centerpiece of Porus's force was a terrifying corps of 200 war elephants. Alexander, faced with a determined enemy on the opposite side of a swollen river, once again displayed his tactical genius. He used a series of feints and a daring nighttime crossing during a thunderstorm to get a portion of his army across the river, surprising the enemy. The ensuing battle was one of the bloodiest and hardest fought of Alexander's career. The Macedonian phalanx had never faced war elephants before. The massive beasts crashed into their lines, creating havoc. But Alexander's men Disciplined and adaptable, targeted the elephant's handlers and flanked the terrified animals, eventually causing them to run amok through their own lines. After a brutal struggle, Porus was defeated. Alexander, so impressed by his opponent's courage, treated him with honor and allowed him to continue ruling his kingdom as an ally. After the victory at the Hydaspes, Alexander wanted to march further to the great river Ganges and the ends of the world. But his army had finally reached its limit. They had been marching and fighting for over 8 years, thousands of miles from their homes. They were exhausted, homesick, and weary of their king's endless ambition. At the Hyphasis River, the men refused to go any further. It was a mutiny. Alexander was furious. He secluded himself in his tent for 3 days, trying to shame his men into changing their minds, but they would not budge. Finally, he relented. In an emotional speech, he praised their achievements but agreed to turn back. It was the only time his army had ever defied him, and the only time his ambition had ever been checked. The mutiny at the Hyphasis was a profound turning point. It marked the practical end of Alexander's eastward expansion. The dream of conquering the entire known world had collided with the reality of human endurance. The journey back would prove to be as deadly as any battle he had ever fought. To return to the heart of his empire, Alexander made a fateful decision. He split his forces, sending part of his army back by sea, while he led the main contingent on a march through the brutal, uncharted Gedrosian desert. The march was a catastrophe. The army was assailed by blistering heat, flash floods, and a complete lack of food and water. Thousands of soldiers, along with their families who followed the camp, perished from thirst, starvation, and heat stroke. It was the greatest disaster of Alexander's career. Why did he do it? Was it a reckless, strategic mistake? Or did he see it as a necessary challenge to rival the mythical journeys of heroes? Whatever the reason, it was a testament to his incredible leadership that he was able to hold the starving army together. He refused any special treatment, famously pouring a helmet full of precious water into the sand in front of his men, declaring that he would not drink if they could not. Alexander survived the desert, but the ordeal had a profound impact. It shattered the health of many of his veterans and further strained his relationship with his men. He had led them to the ends of the earth and back. But the price in suffering had been immense. Alexander spent the final years of his life back in the heart of his empire, focusing on administration and consolidation. He worked tirelessly to organize his vast new territory, establishing a common currency, building roads, and encouraging trade. He was no longer just a general, he was the architect of a new world order. His most ambitious and controversial policy was his attempt to fuse Greek and Persian cultures. He adopted elements of Persian dress and court ceremony, and he encouraged his soldiers and officers to do the same. He incorporated tens of thousands of trained Persian soldiers into the ranks of the Macedonian army, treating them as equals. The ultimate expression of this policy came at a grand ceremony in Susa, where Alexander himself married a daughter of Darius and compelled 80 of his senior officers to marry the daughters of Persian noblemen in a mass wedding. For the traditional Macedonians, these policies were an outrage. For Alexander, they were the essential foundation of a new, stable, multicultural Hellenistic empire, ruled not by Macedonians over Persians, but by a new, unified ruling class. In 324 BCE, Alexander suffered a devastating personal blow. His closest friend, his lifelong companion, and his most trusted general, Hephaestion, suddenly fell ill and died. Alexander was utterly shattered. Hephaestion was the one person he trusted completely, the other half of his soul. Alexander's grief was epic and terrifying. He reportedly lay weeping over his friend's body for a day and a night, refusing to eat or drink. He ordered a period of public mourning across the entire empire and crucified the doctor who had failed to save his friend. He spent a fortune on a monumental funeral pyre for Hephaestion in Babylon and sent messengers to the oracle of Siwa to ask if his friend could be worshipped as a god. The death of Hephaestion broke something inside Alexander. Friends and observers noted that he was never the same again. He plunged himself into heavy drinking and seemed to lose some of his legendary drive and focus. The loss left him isolated and deeply depressed, and likely weakened his own physical health, making him vulnerable to what was to come. In June of 323 BCE, in the city of Babylon, after a long bout of feasting and drinking, Alexander fell gravely ill with a raging fever. For 10 days, the world's most powerful man lay dying, his body racked by pain, unable to speak. The greatest physicians of his empire were powerless to help him. What killed him? Theories have swirled for centuries. Was he poisoned by his rivals, perhaps by those angered by his pro-Persian policies? Was it a sudden relapse of malaria contracted in India? Or was it typhoid fever from contaminated water? The historical evidence is inconclusive. The most likely cause was a virulent disease, his body weakened by years of campaigning, countless wounds, and heavy drinking. As he lay on his deathbed, his generals reportedly asked him to whom he would leave his vast empire. Alexander's final whispered words were said to be, "To the strongest." On June 11, 323 BCE, Alexander the Great died, just shy of his 33rd birthday. The conqueror of the world had been defeated by a foe he could not see and could not fight. Alexander's death left a colossal power vacuum. He had no chosen successor and no legitimate heir. His final words, "To the strongest," were a prophecy of the chaos to come. His most powerful generals, the men who had ridden with him from Macedonia to India, immediately began to vie for control. These men were known as the Diadochi, or the successors. The 40 years following Alexander's death were a period of brutal and relentless warfare, as the Diadochi fought each other for pieces of his empire. The dream of a single, unified Hellenistic world died with its creator. The empire was carved up into several large kingdoms, each ruled by one of Alexander's generals and their descendants. From the ashes of Alexander's empire rose the great Hellenistic kingdoms, the Ptolemaic kingdom in Egypt, founded by his general Ptolemy, the Seleucid Empire in the former Persian heartland, founded by Seleucus, and the Antigonid dynasty in Macedonia. These kingdoms would continue to spread Greek language, art, and ideas throughout the East for the next 300 years. Despite the political collapse of his empire, Alexander's cultural legacy was immense and enduring. His conquests shattered the barriers between East and West. Greek became the common language of trade and scholarship, from the Mediterranean to the borders of India. This fusion of Greek, Persian, Egyptian, and Indian cultures created the vibrant cosmopolitan Hellenistic civilization. Alexander's military genius fundamentally changed the art of war. His masterful use of combined arms, the oblique attack, and his emphasis on speed, surprise, and decisive action became the textbook for military commanders for millennia. Great generals like Hannibal and Julius Caesar studied his campaigns and considered him the greatest commander in history. The world Alexander created was a world of bustling new cities, great libraries, like the one in Alexandria, and unprecedented intellectual exchange. This environment fostered major advances in science, mathematics, philosophy, and art. The Hellenistic age, born from his conquests, was a critical bridge that preserved and expanded upon classical Greek knowledge, eventually passing it on to the Romans and the wider world. In death, Alexander became larger than life. The historical man was quickly enveloped by myth and legend. Stories of his divine birth, his taming of Bucephalus, his cutting of the Gordian knot, and his journey to the ends of the earth were told and retold across the ancient world. He became the central figure in a body of romantic literature known as the Alexander Romance, which was translated into countless languages. He became a figure in Jewish, Christian, and Islamic traditions, often portrayed as a great divinely favored king or prophet. In Persian folklore, he became Iskandar, a legendary national hero. From ancient coins to medieval tapestries to modern Hollywood films, his image has remained a powerful and enduring symbol of ambition and conquest. Today, Alexander remains one of the most compelling and debated figures in history. Was he a civilizing hero who brought enlightenment to the East, or a brutal megalomaniac responsible for the deaths of hundreds of thousands? The truth is that he was both a complex and contradictory figure whose life was too vast to be contained by any single label. From the prince of a small kingdom to the undisputed master of the known world, Alexander's life was a testament to the power of a singular, indomitable will. In 12 short years, he redrew the map of the world, shattered one of history's greatest empires, and initiated a new era of cultural fusion. He was a battlefield commander of unparalleled genius, a leader who inspired godlike devotion in his men, and a visionary who dreamed of a unified global culture. He was also a man of great contradictions, capable of both profound acts of mercy and shocking brutality. A lover of philosophy who murdered his closest friends in fits of rage and paranoia, a liberator who enslaved entire populations. His greatness was forged in violence, and his legacy is a complex tapestry woven with threads of both creation and destruction. Perhaps the ultimate lesson from Alexander's life is about the nature of ambition itself. His story shows us how far a single human being can go when driven by an unshakable belief in their own destiny. It is a timeless, epic, and cautionary tale of what can be achieved and what can be lost in the relentless pursuit of greatness. He remains and will forever remain Alexander the Great.